The last time I had one of these on, I was working with a group of Afghanis. And I don't know if you saw the picture in the booklet. There's this little thing coming out of my ear. That's one of these. They're so weird. So we had a group of Afghanis who came to Cincinnati. And it was a very interesting experience. I did a conflict engagement workshop with them where I trained them in some of the concepts. And I was told before they came that they really wanted to talk a lot, but my job was to teach them. So that if I wanted to teach them, I had to take up a lot of space. So I gave them a formal workshop, and at one point I gave them a story about integrative problem solving. Anybody heard the term integrative problem solving? Okay, it's sort of a concept as distinct from compromise. Compromise, we both want something. We're going to cut it down the middle, or however we're going to arrange that we'll both get some of what we want, but neither of us will get all of what we want. If our problems are about goals, our problems are about resources, then compromising can often work. If our problems are about identities, then giving up part of our need for identity often doesn't work. And so compromise can then make the problem even more intractable or intransigent. Anyway, I was talking with them about goal conflicts where it's possible to do integrative problem solving. By the way, I'm just warming myself up. This is a riff. So I told them a story about a father who died, and he had 17 camels to divide up with his 3 sons. Anybody heard this story? If you've read my book, you've also heard this story. So 17 camels across 3 sons doesn't work. Because if the way they were supposed to be is the first son was supposed to get half, the second son was supposed to get a third, and the third son was supposed to get a sixth. Right? A half of 17, you can't do it. A third of 17, you can't do it, and a sixth of 17, you can't do it. So they were struggling to figure out how to follow their father's will. And a wise man came along, and he said, I have the answer for you. He said, I'll give you a camel, and then you'll have 18. And half of 18 is 9, and 6 into 18 is 3, and 9 into 18 is 2. So you'll all have your camels. If you do the math, you'll see that equals 17, and then I'll take my camel back. That's integrative problem solving. I thought that was a great example. But I noticed when I was telling them, they weren't listening to me. I could see. And so one of them raised his hand. And I have to tell you, when I was telling this story, the first time I was thinking of telling, I said, this will be great, I'll talk about camels. You know, camels from the Middle East. And he raised his hand and he said, we would never do things that way. We would never divide camels up like that. He said, first of all, a father would never give a will where there would be any controversy among their sons. He said, secondly, what we would do is we'd sell the camels and divide the money. So he had a very good integrative solution. Anyway, we had a very good conversation. It was pretty good. And later that day, however, I was on a panel where we were asked to engage them in a dialogue. Happily, somebody else set the terms, or not so happily, as you'll hear. And I was just supposed to be there to respond and to engage this fairly high-level delegation from Afghanistan. And unfortunately, our moderator made 2 fatal mistakes. The first mistake is he told them about their conflict. He said, Afghanistan is divided into this geographical and tribal arrangement. And as he did this, I gripped the table. I thought, oh my gosh, you don't tell people what their conflict is about. I remember some years ago, I was invited to Cyprus to explain to the Greek Cypriots a little bit more about the Turkish Cypriots. And that I said, okay, I can talk with them and help them gain some perspective about those on the other side of the border. When I got there, it turned out there were Turkish Cypriots there. So I said, there's no way I'm going to tell you about them. But what I will do is I'll facilitate a conversation where you'll tell each other about yourselves. I must say it was my best presentation ever. They did all the work. So that's the first thing. He started telling them about their conflict. The second thing is he said, and they missed a couple words, I think. He said, in our media, it is portrayed that you are a country which is about to divide up into these regions. And that the idea of us helping to create, as Americans, helping to create a single polity of Afghanistan, is not going to work. So I'm sort of waiting to see what they're going to do. And in fact, they're looking at him like they looked at me when I talked about camels. And one guy raises his hand and he said, in my 60 years, nobody has ever talked about the dissolution of my country. I said, how dare you? The one next to him said, dissolution of my country, that's a term that would never say about somebody else. The third one repeated it. The first one got up and walked out. Others sort of looked at each other, and 8 of the remaining 10 got up and walked out. And the 2 of them remained behind to try to tell us that this was about them feeling insulted, and that we hadn't really respected or understood their sensitive points, and they were making a statement about us. And in fact, they were making a statement about the whole tour, right? Where I was instructed to tell them, right? They're coming to America, tell them about conflict resolution. Well, I did. Instead, really what they wanted is to be heard. What they wanted is to be heard. Anyway, all of that was just a riff because of this. That I won't say it has nothing to do with my talk, but that's not what my talk is about. What I want to do with you is basically follow what Confucius says about education. Confucius says that I tell you, and you'll forget. But nonetheless, it's probably good to tell you. And I'll suggest why in a minute. He says, I illustrate to you, and you'll remember. He says, I invite you to do it, and you'll understand. So we're going to do something of a sonata today in 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you about my theory, a little bit about my practice, but mostly about my theory. I'm even going to read a paper, which I don't usually do. But I hope you'll indulge me for a half hour or so while I read a paper to you, get your comments and questions. Some of what I tell you, you actually may remember, but most of it will just set a context for part 2 of the sonata. And part 2 is then going into a case study, as I mentioned last night, of our work in Cincinnati following riots there between the black community and the police community. And our effort to help all the participants define, promote, and assess success within the context of this identity-based conflict. So that'll be part 2. And we'll have a break between each part. It'd be nice if I can do each one for an hour. We'll see. Break when the bell strikes. Part 3 then is I'm going to invite you into a mini workshop. We're going to use the same process that we used in Cincinnati, that I used last week with the Moldovans and the week before with the youth, to explore how this community of practice can define, promote, and assess success for our week here. We may use it. We may use it to monitor our success through the week and after we leave the event. But mostly I'm having you do it so you understand it. Okay, and get engaged. So that's the plan. I'm happy for my plan to be disrupted or to be diverted through questions or suggestions. I probably will do it myself. I'll go off on tangents. I'll bring myself back, but so feel free to jump in. Okay? Ready? Okay. Well, I don't have my paper out. I'm not ready. Okay, so this paper is called an Inside Out. Why engaging intragroup conflict, the conflict that happens within groups, may help intergroup negotiations succeed. And essentially, my entire theory of practice is that inside-out approach. That, as we talked about last night, we have to begin with ourselves. We have to know what it is we want, or what the conflicts that we have are about. And more importantly, we have to know why they matter to us. We have to be clear about that. And that, I think, is one of the gifts of conflict, that it demands of us that we get clear about what's going on and why, whether it's about conflict or whether it's about futures they're trying to create. Having done that with ourselves, the possibility of us being able to do that with others, and in the work that I do, those others are usually those within one's identity group, becomes that much greater when I do it with myself. And then my hypothesis, which I have worked on my whole career, and now I'm getting more and more focused on it, is that to the extent to which we want intergroup negotiations to succeed in conditions of identity-based conflict, we need to make sure that intragroup negotiation is done first. That the conflicts within the Israeli side, the conflicts within the Palestinian side, are somewhat addressed, or at least somewhat engaged, in preparation for engaging across the sides. So I hypothesize that a major reason that negotiations over identity-based conflicts fail is that there's inadequate attention given to the process of intragroup pre-negotiation. Identity-based conflicts, both within countries and transcending borders, present the fundamental challenge to a more peaceful world order. Identity-based conflicts are similar to all conflicts in that they include struggles over resources. Or politically stated, what Howard Laswell in the 1950s defined as politics. That is, who will get what, when, and how. So identity conflicts include such resource struggles. Moreover, like most conflicts, they're about clashing and competing goals and priorities. However, identity-based conflicts are a unique class of conflicts that require special handling, because unlike goal or resource conflicts, they're deeply rooted in historical fears, frustrations, traumas to groups' existential needs and values. Too often, such conflicts go from bad to worse when opponents in such conflicts prematurely meet and try to solve problems or negotiate solutions before sufficient intra-group agreement has occurred. Characteristic of many identity-based conflicts is that the more deeply they run and the longer they last, the more internal schisms within each side become part of the Gordian knot of such conflicts. Then, as moderate groups within each side begin to lean in toward one another, the hardliners within each side lean out, and the likelihood of intergroup agreement further diminishes. Intergroup pre-negotiation, focusing first on the internal dynamics of disagreement and consensus building within their own groups, I believe could enhance the chances of successful negotiation between these groups by disabling this tendency before it takes root, the tendency of internal schism then being projected onto the other side. Based on a combination of my own experience as an intervener in identity-based conflicts around the world, Israeli-Palestinian has been the main conflict I've worked on, but I've also worked in Cyprus, in Northern Ireland, in South Africa, various parts of the former Soviet Union, black-white conflicts in the United States, and so forth. And from my own theorizing to understand my failures, I suggest that negotiation theorists and practitioners pay more systematic attention to the internal dynamics of pre-negotiation within each side. I think this will create a trajectory as well as a conditioning for what we have to do when parties come together. When groups are internally divided and splinter into opposing camps, reaching agreement with an outgroup becomes almost impossible. This is the common cyclical dynamic, the negative spiral in intransigent conflicts. Internal dynamics lead at least to differences over agenda and tactics, if not essential strategies. Sides become convinced or coerced that negotiation is somehow useful at this point, or less harmful than not engaging. Parties begin negotiation without sufficient internal agreement, And then such internal dynamics play themselves out vociferously when the sides meet and things get worse. These dynamics include projections of each side's failings as a way to, in part, to avoid, or they think even to heal, continuing rifts within each side's own family, attributions about the negative character of the other side, and then polarization between the good us and the bad them. To make progress in what's been variously called protracted social conflicts by my teacher Ed Azar, identity-based conflict, which is what I've termed the focus, intractable conflicts by a man named Peter Coleman, who's doing a great deal of work on that, intransigent conflicts by Mark Ross. Something has to break this internal-external conflict escalation cycle. To break the cycle, I suggest a two-step process of goals to grievances that each side engage in, first within their side, and then again between their sides in a reverse order. That is, grievances to goals. Okay, so within your own group, you articulate what are our goals in this conflict dynamic we're about, and then what grievances do we have about them. When you meet with them, you articulate your grievances about the other side, and then you work together to reach goals together. That's the method that I use and am trying to develop further. So the first step is for sides to gather key representatives of central, often opposing positions within their own side. So from right to left on each side, vis-a-vis the other side. So what's the range of positions on my side about them? Let me bring that range to an intra-group negotiation, and vice versa. The second step is for participants in this intra-group pre-negotiation process to reach agreement on their goals for the future. What are their goals for a future that will meet the needs that this range of political views has? And in fact, it's kind of it is a unity building process. When it comes to their attitudes toward the other side, they're very divided. When it comes to their goals, at least at the highest level, not operationalized, they're going to reach agreements on the goals to have a secure future for their children. They'll reach goals to have a future in which their identity and dignity is recognized. Basically, they'll reach agreements on the kinds of fundamental human needs that Galtung and Burton and that whole range of needs theorists have articulated as core to what sustains and aggravates ethnic or identity-based conflict. Then, having reached agreement on the high-level goals that they have, whether they're right-wingers or left-wingers, peace-seekers or warmongers within their own side, they'll then say, now, what are our grievances about the other side? And they can converge basically on those grievances as well. These two steps are then repeated when the sides meet, however, in reverse order. That is, the first thing that's said when they meet the other side is, here are grievances about you. And we begin our process with surfacing and making explicit the antagonism and the animosity they have towards each other. And then having done that, they move into goals. Let me give you a very small example from Moldova last week. Remember I told you about the case study we used, right? The mother and father-in-law who got married, got divorced, lived together again. So what we did is we had each side go apart separately and first talk about their own ideals for their lives separately. Then we said to them, now, what are the grievances that you have as husband, wife, former, about the other? List your grievances. Make a list of them. They treated me disrespectfully, I don't have my own space, they haven't cooperated, they haven't helped me, all the sorts of antagonisms and attributions. And we list those and help them describe them. Then we come and we list them on a flip chart. We say, here's the grievances that I, wife, former husband, have about you. Flip a coin. Whoever wins the coin toss asks them a question about their grievances. And we begin a dynamic of antagonism. And we invite them to basically repeat history within this setting. It's very difficult, very painful, very vociferous, very antagonistic. In the model, it goes on for 4-6 hours, listing, reciting the things that we have against you. Our attributions about you, our projections about you, our polarizations about you, our blaming of you. And then at some point, we say to them, how are we doing? And they say, horrible. They say, why are you doing this to us? We say, we're not doing anything to you. We're just inviting you to do what you've been doing for the last 40 years in an artistically intensified way. So you can study it and make some choices about it. So what do you think about this? We think it's horrible. You making any progress? No. Does this remind you of what has happened up until now? Exactly. Do you want to keep doing it? No. You don't? No, we really don't. So you want to try something different? You say yes. All right, so will you give us the process power to lead you into something different? Please. Anything. So we say, okay, so now instead of talking about your grievances of them, now go back and think about in your own self, or we had them play, all of them, a collective of pashas and a collective of romans. So now take this statement, you have not enabled me to live my own life, or you have been oppressive to me, or you have taken up too much space, and now reverse that and talk about what you need. Instead of pointing your finger at them and blaming them for what they've done to you, look at your other 3 fingers pointing back at yourself and ask, why do I care so deeply? Why does this matter to me so much? What did I do to contribute to it? And as you do this, think of ways to illustrate that state that you would like. So instead of feeling oppressed by them, what I want is the ability to express my own sense of freedom. Your own sense of freedom. Okay, now tell us when you've had an experience of freedom. Come up with a story. Okay, so that's how they prepare. So this intragroup preparation phase, again, I'm making some fairly big analogies of the individual who's now collective to a group of Israelis or a group of Palestinians, a group of police officers, a group of African Americans. But it's the same method. And the same method is to say, I'm going to convert the antagonism into an articulation of resonance within my own side, being clear what really matters to me deeply. And then I'm going to come together and we're going to have a different type of dialogue. And so they come back together. They've listed on this chart those things that they want with a word that summarizes it. So I want freedom. And then they're going to tell a story or give an illustration about what freedom means to them, where they've had an experience of freedom. And this discourse then changes everything. It changes the frame, it changes the focus, it changes the dynamic. And if and when, not if, and when they start moving back into the antagonism, we then say, remember you asked us, invited us to control the process? And the way we need to control it is to stop you when you're going back and invite you to go forward. That is, back into antagonism and instead forward into the future that you want based on the underlying values and needs that you have. Okay, so that's the process. So groups surface and engage in dialogue about their grievances, making sure they're adequately aired and on the table, and then and only then do they move from the identity-based grievances about the past to visions and cooperative goal-oriented negotiation about a new future based on their visions of lives that they want to have, and maybe some experiences that they've had those lives. So one of the key problems in this sequencing, addresses is that in normal interest-based negotiation, parties who come to the table with deep grievances that are not systematically aired are rarely able to develop an adequate or authentic future orientation due to the lurking but unsurfaced grievances about the past, as I'm sure David will be talking about much more on Thursday. Making explicit those grievances, making them discussable, can go a long way to making the psychological space necessary for parties to develop a necessary perspective, allowing them, urging them to see the past for what it was, for what it is, rather, doesn't go away, important, often painful, and not to be forgotten, but also not to overshadow the possibility that a future can be forged based on goals for that future, and the lessons from the past can be learned and not subconsciously or aggressively repeated. In addition to reducing the likelihood of intergroup explosion and possibility of mutually acceptable negotiation outcomes, the internal negotiation process may usefully serve as a form of intragroup conditioning. That is the sort of dynamic that happens within the Israeli group, within the Palestinian group, as they move from their own goals, grievances, and then back to their articulation of what they deeply desire, also then can take place when they meet with each other. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, 1973 to 1977, not necessarily one of my favorite leaders, is famous, however, for saying that he never began a negotiation until the agreement was already in hand. A bit more modestly, I suggest that in identity-based conflicts, negotiation should be launched after each side separately, often with the assistance of third parties like us, works on its own house in ways that also set an agenda for meeting with the other side. Once successful outcomes are in sight during these pre-negotiations, each side must strategize also, both separately and in a coordinated way, about how best to communicate with and often persuade its own hardliners that agreement with the other side is not abdication or dangerous concession, but instead fuller expression and protection of its own identity needs. Okay, so that's the broad sweep. I'm about to move to a contingency model of talking about how we use it when, but let's see if there's any questions or confusions so far. With me more or less? Can't tell. Yes?
On this list of what I made from your presentation, I just identified 3 points. The third one is to let people engage in dialogues within big groups to tell the other side who they killed, who they won. And it seems to me that at this stage, all the people can tell what they want and what they dislike about the other. How they make moving beyond this years and this needs and wants. Well, my question is how from just saying about what they want to integral.
To the integrated problem-solving idea that I started off with in the beginning, the story about the camels. How do they move from antagonism, in my jargon, to resonance, right? From us versus them to we together in terms of what we want, why we care about it, to some kind of active planning and agenda setting. That's really part 2 of this presentation, but I can highlight it. In many ways, the main point of everything I'm talking about is agenda setting. What is it that's going to set our agenda for that kind of concrete action? If what's going to set our agenda is our antagonism towards you, then our practice is going to be antagonistic practice. If what's going to set our agenda towards you is our sense of our needs and our values and our stories that need to be recognized, that need to be expressed, then that's going to set our agenda. It's really what sets our frame. And the antagonism to resonance is framing as we normally have to reframing as we could do. Okay? So it's a stage setting. Now, how do we know when to use which approach of dealing deeply with grievances or moving folks already to talking about a future orientation? I think one of the ways that we do this, and I talked about it very briefly last night, is the notion that we have to have a model of conflict. And the model of conflict I talk about is a contingency model. For those of you who were here last year with me, I presented this briefly then as well. And the contingency model says that on the surface, the most obvious type of conflict, called type 1, are over resources. What we heard about last night: energy, environment, economics, the concretes. And for resource conflicts, really what we need to do is be inventive. 17 camels can't be divided up. Let's figure out how to get another camel. So we do an integrative process. I call it invention. A deeper type of conflict is conflict over objectives or goals. So I want energy, I want oil. What do I want it for? What's its purpose? So if this is the what, this is the what for. And if I'm going to understand your objectives, then I want to understand why they matter to you. Why you care about having energy. To have a good life, to have opportunity, to live a freedom. What is it that I want it for? So, I've messed up my chart a little bit. So for objectives, we have to dig out people's, what I call resonance. I'll clean this chart up a bit later. So why do I care about my goals? Why are they important? So if we have an objective-based conflict, we have to start before problem solving and begin with a little bit more about our reasons. Now, type 3 conflict, the deepest type, which I've been talking about now, are identity-based. I've been reading a lot about identity lately and trying to work on a different book and trying to get cogent definitions. And one of the best definitions I've found is by the psychologist Erik Erikson in his book called Dimensions of a New Identity, 1973 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities. He says very cogently, a sense of identity means a sense of being at one with oneself as one grows and develops. It's an internal definition of self. And it means at the same time a sense of affinity with a community sense of being at one with its future as well as its history or mythology. Myth in the sense of an organizing vehicle of life, not as in a sense of a falsehood. Okay, so my own sense of being at one with myself and my sense of affinity with a community of practice, a community as it grows and develops. Okay, so if we have an identity-based conflict, which usually is about conflict that's come from the past, where my collective sense of security or well-being is threatened or frustrated by some other group, then what we need to be doing is really articulating antagonism. Oh, I should do this chart over. I'll do this chart over in a minute, so don't copy this down. Okay. Let me give you one other example of identity conflict. It's one of my favorites. Again, maybe last year some of you heard this. In Cyprus, I met with an old man. He must have been in his 80s. I was talking with him about the history of conflict in Cyprus and his experience with it. This was a Greek Cypriot. And I asked him about his past and some of the things that he